On April 2nd, 1982, at 06:30 local time, Governor Rex Hunt telephoned London from Government House in Stanley to report that Argentine amphibious forces were ashore on East Falkland. 69 Royal Marines of Naval Party 8901, commanded by Major Mike Norman, had already engaged them at Moody Brook Barracks with GPMGs and 84mm Carl Gustavs. By 09:25, Hunt had ordered them to lay down arms. The photograph taken minutes later, Marines face down on the wet grass, hands behind their heads, watched by Argentine Special Forces in balaclavas, reached the Ministry of Defence in Whitehall by teleprinter that afternoon. Margaret Thatcher was told in the Commons members' lobby. She did not sit down. The Chief of the Naval Staff, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, walked into the Prime Minister's room off the chamber that evening, still in full uniform, having come directly from Portsmouth. Thatcher asked whether the islands could be retaken. Leach answered that a task force could sail within 48 hours, and that if Britain did not send one, in a few months' time we shall be living in a different country whose word counts for little. John Nott, Defence Secretary, whose 1981 White Paper had proposed scrapping HMS Invincible and paying off HMS Hermes, sat opposite. Nott's carriers were now the only means of projecting air power 8,000 miles south. The arithmetic was brutal. The Fuerza Aérea Argentina fielded roughly 200 combat aircraft. Mirage 3 EA interceptors, Israeli-built Dagger fighter bombers, 4 Skyhawks in 3 squadrons, and critically 5 Dassault Super Étendards armed with air-launched Exocet AM-39 missiles delivered by France the previous November. Britain's response, embarked aboard Hermes and Invincible, would total 20 Sea Harrier FRS.1s of 800 and 801 naval air squadrons, not 200, 20. Not as subsonic, single-engine, thrust-vectoring V/STOL aircraft, designed for close air defence of the fleet, not air superiority over a contested archipelago. Top speed at altitude, Mach 0.97. The Mirage 3 EA could reach Mach 2.2. At the Joint Intelligence Committee on April 5th, chaired by Sir Anthony Ackland at the Cabinet Office, the assessment circulated by the Defence Intelligence Staff estimated that the Argentine Air Force could sustain 60 sorties a day over the operational area from bases at Rio Grande, Rio Gallegos, and Comodoro Rivadavia. The Sea Harrier's radius of action from Hermes would give pilots roughly 20 minutes on station. The imbalance was not a matter of quality, it was geometry. The mainland runways were 400 miles from Stanley. The carriers had to stand off to the east of the islands, beyond the range of land-based strike aircraft, which pushed combat air patrols further still. Sharkey Ward, commanding 801 Naval Air Squadron aboard Invincible, wrote in his logbook during the passage south that his pilots would fly the aircraft to the edge of its envelope and slightly beyond. Nigel Sharkey Ward and Andy Auld of 800 NAS spent the 3-week transit rewriting tactics. They abandoned the Fleet Air Arms Standard 2-aircraft combat air patrol doctrine and adopted a loose juice derived from US Navy Vietnam experience, pairing aircraft to cover each other's blind cone. They calibrated the Blue Fox radar, whose look-down performance over land was poor, against the Ferranti inertial navigation system. The single decisive variable was the AIM-9L Sidewinder. Ronald Reagan's administration, over the objections of Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick, had authorized transfer of the all-aspect infrared missile from US stocks at Sigonella in mid-April. The older AIM-9G required a rear quarter shot. The AIM-9L did not. On May 1, 1982, over West Falkland at 09:52 local time, that difference would be tested for the first time. Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton of 801 NAS, on loan from the RAF, was flying wingman to Lieutenant Steve Thomas at 10,000 feet southwest of Stanley, when Invincible's Type 102 2 radar called 2 contacts closing from the west. The controllers on the carrier were tracking a raid from Grupo 8 de Caza, flying Mirage 3EAs out of Rio Gallegos, tasked to draw Sea Harriers away from a simultaneous Canberra bomber strike. Thomas turned into the intercept. Barton climbed to 18,000 feet. The Argentine flight leader, Captain Garcia Cuerva, launched a Matra R.530 head-on at maximum range. The missile went ballistic. Barton rolled inverted, pulled through, and acquired Lieutenant Perona's Mirage on his port quarter. The Blue Fox growl in his headset shifted to the higher-pitched AIM-9L acquisition tone. He fired at 4,000 feet. The missile tracked, detonated behind the Mirage's tailpipe, and the aircraft disintegrated. Perona ejected and drifted down over Pebble Island. Garcia Cuerva, damaged and streaming fuel, tried to divert to Stanley Airfield. The Argentine anti-aircraft gunners, unbriefed, shot him down over the town. He was killed. 2 Mirages lost, no Sea Harriers even damaged. At the same moment, 20 miles to the north, Lieutenant Commander Nigel Ward and Lieutenant Mike Watson engaged a Canberra B.62 of Grupo 2 de Bombardeo. Ward closed to 1,000 yards astern and fired an AIM-9L. The Canberra's port engine exploded, and the aircraft cartwheeled into the sea. Later that afternoon, Flight Lieutenant Bertie Penfold destroyed a Dagger of Grupo 6 with a single missile shot over Chartres settlement. 3 confirmed kills in one day. No British losses in air-to-air combat. The tactical significance was understood before the sun set. Vice Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse at Northwood, running the campaign from the underground headquarters at HMS Warrior, signalled the carrier group that the Mirage force would probably not re-enter the combat air patrol zone at altitude. He was correct. From May 2nd onwards, the Fuerza Aérea Argentina restructured its operations. Mirages were held back to defend the mainland against a feared Vulcan raid, and the Skyhawks and Daggers were pushed down to wave-top height for the run into San Carlos water, where they hoped to slip beneath the Sea Harrier CAP and beneath Sea Dart radar horizons. The decision that turned the air war was made in Buenos Aires, not London. Brigadier General Basilio Lamy Dozo, commanding the Fuerza Aérea Argentina, kept his best fighters north because he could not afford to lose more of them defending a runway 400 miles offshore. The Sea Harrier had done in 2 hours what no naval intelligence estimate at Northwood had thought possible in a month. It had removed the top cover threat. What remained was the low-level bomber problem. Skyhawks and Daggers still had numbers, still had determination, and still had the range to reach the anchorages once the amphibious landing began. They also had unfused bombs. The retard tails on their snake eye and parachute-braked ordnance were set for medium-altitude release, and the air crews were now attacking at 50 feet. Roughly half the bombs that hit British ships did not detonate. The rules of engagement issued from Northwood on April 30th had cleared British forces to attack Argentine aircraft anywhere south of latitude 35 degrees. The fusing failures were the enemy's own doing. The Sea Harrier pilots flew as many as 4 sorties a day from decks pitching in South Atlantic weather. Between May 1st and June 14th, they claimed 20 air-to-air kills for no combat losses in air-to-air engagement. 6 Sea Harriers were lost in the campaign, to ground fire, accident, and, in the case of Lieutenant Nick Taylor, of 800 NAS on May 4th, to a Roland surface-to-air missile at Goose Green. The killing had barely started. The Vulcan raid was the RAF's contribution to convincing General Lamy Dozo to keep his Mirages at home. Operation Black Buck, one launched on the night of April 30th, 1982, from RAF Ascension Island. A coral speck 3,900 miles from Stanley, leased from the United States and the only staging point available. Squadron leader Martin Withers of 44 Squadron flew the primary Vulcan B.2 XM607, refueled 7 times by Victor K. 2 tankers of 55 and 57 squadrons, in a plan drawn up in a fortnight by Group Captain Jerry Price at Waddington. 21 bombs were dropped across Stanley Runway from 10,000 feet at 04:46 local time. One crater struck the tarmac. The military effect was marginal. Argentine engineers filled the hole within 24 hours. C-130 Hercules continued flying supplies in at night throughout the campaign. The political effect was not marginal. Buenos Aires now had to contemplate that a strategic bomber based on the doctrine of nuclear delivery over the North German plain could reach the Argentine mainland. Mendoza, Córdoba, Buenos Aires itself lay within Vulcan range if the RAF chose to extend the operation. Lamidozo's Mirages were now doubly committed to home defense. 6 further Black Buck missions followed. The last on June 12th expended AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missiles against Argentine radars. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office was running a parallel war. Sir Anthony Parsons, Britain's permanent representative at the UN, secured Resolution 502 on April 3rd by 10 votes to 1. The Soviet Union abstaining, which the FCO analysts had not expected, and which Sir Anthony Duff at Cabinet Office noted, was the single most useful diplomatic outcome of the crisis. Alexander Haig, US Secretary of State, began shuttling between Buenos Aires and London on April 8th with a plan for joint administration. Thatcher told him at Chequers on April 9th that sovereignty was not negotiable while Argentine troops occupied British territory. Haig went home. Caspar Weinberger at the Pentagon quietly authorized the AIM-9L transfer and released stocks of Sidewinders, JP-5 fuel at Ascension, and satellite intelligence via the CIA station in London. The intelligence relationship mattered. GCHQ at Cheltenham had been reading low-grade Argentine naval and air force traffic since the mid-1970s. The higher-grade material came from a different source. Signals intercepted at Chile's DIFA facility and passed under a private arrangement between Sir Colin Figures, C of MI6, and General Fernando Mate of the Chilean Air Force. The junta in Buenos Aires never realized that Santiago was providing warning of raids launching from Rio Grande. British Type 42 destroyers on picket duty could scramble Sea Harrier, CAP, into intercept position minutes before the Argentine strike arrived. The picket ships paid for that warning. HMS Sheffield, a Type 42, was struck by an Exocet AM-39 on May 4th at 14:04 local time. The missile fired by Lieutenant Commander Augusto Bedacaratz from a super étendard of 2A Escuadrilla Aeronaval de Caza y Ataque. The warhead failed to detonate. The missile propellant did. 20 men died. Captain Sam Salt gave the order to abandon ship at 1850 after the fires reached the missile magazines. The photograph of Sheffield burning, taken from HMS Arrow, was on the front page of every British newspaper on May 5th. Sir Frank Cooper, Permanent Undersecretary at the MOD, held a press briefing at Whitehall that afternoon at which he refused to confirm the ship's identity for 4 hours. The Argentine Navy already knew. So did GCHQ. The silence was for the families. Commander Nick Barker's HMS Endurance, meanwhile, was still south of the exclusion zone in South Georgia. That island had already fallen and been retaken. South Georgia had been the opening move. On April 3rd, a party of Argentine Marines had overwhelmed 22 Royal Marines under Lieutenant Keith Mills at King Edward Point, Grytviken. Mills's men shot down a Puma helicopter with an 84mm Carl Gustaf and put an Alouette 3 out of action with GPMG fire before surrendering to overwhelming force. On April 25th, Operation Paraquet, the reconquest, went in. SASD Squadron under Major Cedric Delves inserted onto the Fortuna Glacier by Wessex helicopter and had to be extracted after 2 of the 3 aircraft crashed in whiteout conditions. No one was killed. It was the first British setback of the campaign, and it took place before most of the country knew there was a campaign. The Argentine submarine Santa Fe was caught on the surface off Grytviken by a Wessex 3 from HMS Antrim on the morning of April 25th, attacked with an Mark 11 depth charge and finished off by Lynx helicopters from Brilliant and Plymouth, firing AS-12 wire-guided missiles. Delves went ashore with a scratch force of 45 men, including SAS, SBS, and Royal Marines. Lieutenant Commander Alfredo Astes, the Argentine commander at Grytviken, already wanted in Sweden and France for the disappearance of citizens during the Dirty War, surrendered without firing a shot. Rex Hunt's deputy governor's wife heard the news on the BBC World Service at midnight London time. Thatcher stepped outside number 10 and told reporters, "Just rejoice at that news." The main landing was still 3 weeks away. Brigadier Julian Thompson of 3 Commando Brigade, embarked on HMS Fearless, had chosen San Carlos Water on the north coast of East Falkland after the SAS and SBS reconnaissance patrols confirmed the beaches were clear and the surrounding hills were unoccupied. The reconnaissance had put men ashore from HMS Onyx and by Sea King helicopter as early as May 1st. Captain Aldwyn White of the SBS and Major Ewan Southby Taylor of the Royal Marines, who had commanded the Naval Party 8901 detachment on the Falklands in 1978, and who kept a hand-drawn survey of every beach on the archipelago, walked the coast at night in April and May. Their charts underwrote the entire landing plan. D-Day was May 21st. At 400 local time, the first landing craft from Fearless and Intrepid grounded at Blue Beach 1 San Carlos settlement. By 800, 2 and 3 Battalions Parachute Regiment, 40 and 45 Commando Royal Marines, and 42 Commando were ashore with no opposition on the beaches. The Argentine army had left the northwest of East Falkland undefended, judging correctly that any landing there would face a long approach march to Stanley across the trackless bogs of the Falkland interior. The Argentine Air Force made them pay for that judgment in ships instead. For 6 days from May 21st, the Fuerza Aérea Argentina and the Comando de Aviación Naval Argentina flew everything they had at the anchorage. HMS Ardent went down on May 21st, hit by 9 bombs from Skyhawks and daggers. 22 men killed. HMS Antelope exploded on May 24th when a bomb disposal officer, Staff Sergeant Jim Prescott, was killed trying to defuse an unexploded 1,000-pounder. HMS Coventry was lost on May 25th with 19 dead, capsized by 3 bomb hits from a 4Bs of Group 05. The same day, the container ship Atlantic Conveyor, converted to carry Chinook and Wessex helicopters, was struck by 2 Exocets fired from Super Étendards. 12 men died and, with them, went the heavy lift helicopter fleet that was to have carried 3 brigade to Stanley. The infantry would walk. They walked with 120-pound Bergens across ground, the Marines called yomping, and the paras called tabbing. From Port San Carlos to Douglas Settlement, from Douglas to Teal Inlet, from Teal Inlet to the mountains west of Stanley. 40 miles of peat bog, tussock grass and stone runs, in wind that reached 70 knots and temperatures below freezing at night. 45 Commando under Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Whitehead covered the distance in 3 days. 3 para under Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pike marched parallel to them. 42 Commando was helicoptered forward when Sea Kings could be spared, which was rarely. 2 para under Lieutenant Colonel Herbert H. Jones went south instead of east. Jones had been given, then denied, then given again permission to attack the Argentine garrison at Goose Green. 1,200 men of the 12th Infantry Regiment and elements of the 25th dug in on the isthmus above the Darwin settlement. The BBC World Service, briefed by an MOD official who has never been publicly named, announced on May 27th that a para-battalion was moving on Goose Green. Jones, in his forming up position on the eve of the assault, is reported to have said he would sue the BBC when he got home. The attack went in at 06:30 on May 28th. It took 14 hours. Jones was killed leading a platoon-strength assault against a machine gun position at Darwin Hill. Major Chris Keeble, his second-in-command, took over and, after the Argentine positions had been reduced through the afternoon, negotiated the surrender of 1,200 prisoners the following morning. 15 British soldiers were dead. Jones received a posthumous Victoria Cross. Historians have argued since Sir Lawrence Freedman in the official history is measured, others less so, about whether the attack was militarily necessary or politically demanded. The men who took Goose Green were not consulted on the question. Major General Jeremy Moore, commanding the land forces, came ashore from QE2 on May 30th after the transit south aboard the Cunard liner, requisitioned for 5 infantry brigade. Moore's brigade, 2nd Battalion Scots Guards, 1st Battalion Welsh Guards, 1st Battalion 7th Gurkha Rifles, was less experienced in cold weather operations than 3 Commando Brigade. The Welsh Guards were being ferried forward aboard the LSL Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram on June 8th when Argentine fours of Group 05, undetected by radar because of terrain masking at Fitzroy, attacked the ships at anchor. 3 500-pound bombs hit Galahad, 2 hit Tristram. 56 men died, 32 of them Welsh Guards, and the photographs of Simon Weston and other burned survivors being lifted off the beach entered British national memory. The final battles were fought over the ring of low mountains that command Stanley. Mount Longdon, 2 Sisters Mount Harriet on the night of June 11th to 12th. Wireless Ridge, Tumbledown, Mount William on the night of June 13th to 14th. The 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment took Longdon in a 10-hour night action, costing 23 British dead. Sergeant Ian Mackay of 4 Platoon, B Company, charged an Argentine machine gun position single-handed and was killed on the objective. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. On Tumbledown, 2nd Battalion Scots Guards under Lieutenant Colonel Michael Scott fought the 5th Marine Infantry Battalion, the best Argentine unit on the islands, with rifle, grenade and bayonet. 9 guardsmen died, the bayonets were used. At 2100 on June 14th, Argentine troops on the outskirts of Stanley began throwing away their rifles. Brigadier General Mario Menendez surrendered to Major General Moore at Government House in Stanley at 23:59 local time on June 14th, 1982. The instrument of surrender drafted by Colonel Michael Rose of the SAS after a helicopter shuttle, in which Rose negotiated by radio with Menendez's staff, initially contained the word unconditional. Moore struck it out with a pen before signing. The photograph, Moore in field uniform, Menendez in his Argentine Army dress jacket, Rose standing between them, was flown to London aboard a VC-10 the following day and appeared in every British newspaper on June 16th. Thatcher announced the surrender to the House of Commons at 22:15 on June 14th. She read from a signal from Moore. The Falkland Islands are once more under the government desired by their inhabitants. God save the Queen. The chamber cheered. In the cabinet room afterwards, John Nott, who had offered his resignation on April 5th and had it refused, poured whiskey. The cost had been 255 British dead, 88 Royal Navy and Royal Marines, 123 Army, 27 Royal Fleet Auxiliary and Merchant Navy, 1 civilian on the islands and 1 RAF. Argentine losses were 649, roughly half of them from the cruiser General Belgrano, torpedoed by HMS Conqueror on May 2nd outside the total exclusion zone in a decision that Thatcher took personally at Chequers on the recommendation of the War Cabinet. The Belgrano decision remains the most contested British action of the war. Sir Terence Lewin, Chief of the Defence Staff, presented the intelligence assessment at Chequers on May 2nd that the Argentine surface fleet, including the carrier 25 de Mayo to the north and the Belgrano group to the south, was executing a pincer movement against the British task force. The rules of engagement were amended to permit attack on the Belgrano outside the exclusion zone. Commander Chris Rayford Brown of HMS Conqueror fired 3 Mark 8 torpedoes at 15:57 Greenwich Mean Time. 323 Argentine sailors died. The Argentine surface fleet returned to port for the duration of the war. Clive Ponting, a civil servant at the MOD, leaked documents in 1984 to the Labour MP Tam Dalyell suggesting that the Belgrano had been sailing away from the task force when torpedoed. Ponting was prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act 1911 and acquitted by a jury in February 1985, a verdict that led directly to the 1989 revision of the Act. The Franks Committee, chaired by Lord Franks and reporting in January 1983, examined the diplomatic and intelligence failures that had preceded the Argentine invasion. Its conclusion was cautious to the point of tenderness. The government had not been directly at fault. Nicholas Ridley's 1980 leaseback proposal to Parliament, which had been shouted down by MPs of both parties, was not revisited. The intelligence picture in the weeks before April 2nd had in fact been mixed. The Joint Intelligence Committee assessment of July 9, 1981, chaired at that stage by Sir Anthony Ackland, had judged that Argentina would not resort to force in the short term. A JIC assessment of March 30, 1982, 2 days before the invasion, upgraded the threat but did not conclude that invasion was imminent. Signal traffic intercepted by GCHQ from the Argentine fleet on March 31st, indicating naval movements consistent with an amphibious operation, was passed to Downing Street only late on March 31st. Thatcher wrote in her memoirs that it was the worst moment of her premiership. She had 48 hours to decide whether to fight. The consequences ran further than the South Atlantic. In Moscow, the KGB First Chief Directorate's Third Department, which handled the United Kingdom, filed an assessment in July 1982 that the Falklands Campaign had demonstrated a British capacity for expeditionary warfare that had not been credited in Warsaw Pact planning since the Suez collapse of 1956. The report, later described by Oleg Gordievsky, the SIS penetration of the KGB London Residentura, who defected in 1985, noted that the operation had been mounted 8,000 miles from base without American ground forces, against an adversary equipped with modern French and Israeli aircraft, and had succeeded within 11 weeks. The judgment in the Politburo, according to Gordievsky's later debriefing at Fort Monkton, was that British defence expenditure would now rise, and that the projected withdrawal of naval assets under Nott's 1981 review would be reversed. Both judgments were correct. HMS Invincible, sold to Australia before the war, was retained. HMS Endurance, whose withdrawal from South Atlantic patrols had been read in Buenos Aires as a signal of British disinterest, was reinstated. The Sea Harrier fleet was expanded. 809 Naval Air Squadron stood down before the war and hastily reformed to reinforce the task force, was retained. The Type 42 destroyer program continued with the Batch 3 ships lengthened to accommodate the Sea Dart magazine reload problem that had been identified during the campaign. The Knot review in effect was cancelled by the Argentine junta. At Greenham Common in Berkshire the same summer, women had been camped at the perimeter fence since September 1981 in protest against the deployment of ground-launched cruise missiles under the NATO double-track decision of December 1979. The first 96 BGM-109G Griffin missiles arrived at RAF Greenham Common in November 1983, under command of the USAF 501st Tactical Missile Wing, but with a Royal Air Force police detachment, and, per the exchange of notes negotiated by Michael Heseltine as Defence Secretary, a British veto on use. The dual-key arrangement was not a legal mechanism. It was a political undertaking by Reagan to Thatcher, given at Camp David in December 1984. Thatcher's relationship with Reagan had survived the Falklands and had survived the American invasion of Grenada in October 1983. A member of the Commonwealth, the invasion of which Thatcher learned of by telephone from Reagan hours before it began. She telephoned back in fury. The transcript released in 2013 has Thatcher telling the president, "This action will be seen as intervention by a Western country in the internal affairs of a small independent nation." Reagan apologized. The invasion went ahead. Sir Geoffrey Howe at the Foreign Office spent the next fortnight repairing the diplomatic damage. Cheltenham was doing better work than Grenada. GCHQ under Sir Peter Mary Church was, from 1983, part of the assessment that led Downing Street to identify Mikhail Gorbachev as the coming man in the Politburo, before the Americans did. Malcolm Rifkin, Minister of State at the FCO, had visited Moscow in 1984 and reported back that Gorbachev's file, prepared by the Soviet section under Christopher Malaby, showed a Politburo member of a different generation and disposition. Thatcher's meeting with Gorbachev at Chequers on December 16, 1984, arranged through a Politburo invitation extended to Gorbachev as chairman of the Supreme Soviet's Foreign Affairs Commission, produced the "I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together" formulation to the BBC on the doorstep of Chequers. She had by that point been talking to him for 5 hours. The Cold War was moving. Gordievsky's material was moving with it. Between 1974 and 1985, Colonel Oleg Antonyevich Gordievsky, deputy resident at the KGB London station from June 1982 and resident designate from May 1985, supplied MI6 with continuous access to KGB and GRU operations in Britain, and from 1981 to Operation RYAN, the Soviet intelligence collection plan directed at detecting a NATO surprise nuclear attack. The RYAN reports, delivered to Christopher Kerwin at MI6 and passed through Percy Cradock at the JIC to Downing Street, showed the Politburo genuinely believed Reagan might launch a first strike. The Able Archer 83 Command Post exercise in November 1983 had caused Soviet strategic forces to be brought to increased readiness. Cradock's assessment, delivered to Thatcher in December 1983, was that Soviet fear was real and that Reagan should be told. Thatcher told him. She flew to Washington in December 1984 and delivered Gordievsky's material, sanitized to protect the source, to Reagan at Camp David. The subsequent moderation of American rhetoric and the abandonment of the evil empire formulation from Reagan's second-term speeches is attributed by Christopher Andrew in the Authorized History of MI5 and by Percy Cradock in his own memoir to the intelligence Gordievsky had supplied. It was, in Cradock's later phrase, the single most important piece of Cold War intelligence Britain ever passed to the Americans. Gordievsky was exfiltrated from Moscow on July 19, 1985 under Operation Pimlico by Viscount Asquith and Roy Ascot of the SIS Moscow station, in the boot of an embassy Ford Sierra, past a KGB surveillance team that had been on him for 11 weeks. At Reykjavik in October 1986, Reagan and Gorbachev came within a signature of abolishing all strategic nuclear weapons. Thatcher was not present. She was, however, informed hourly by the FCO's political director, Sir Patrick Wright, via the British Embassy in Reykjavik under Sir Nicholas Barrington. When Reagan telephoned her from Air Force One on the return flight to describe how close he had come to trading away the American strategic deterrent, Thatcher, who considered that the British Trident program, agreed with Carter in 1980 and confirmed with Reagan in 1982, depended on the continuation of American strategic modernization, flew to Camp David the following month and, in her own account, reminded the President of the facts of life. The Camp David statement of November 15, 1986, reaffirmed nuclear deterrence. The Berlin Wall opened on the night of November 9, 1989. Thatcher's reaction, formed within hours in consultation with Douglas Hurd at the Foreign Office and Sir Percy Cradock as her foreign policy advisor, was more cautious than that of Bush or Kohl. She feared, and said so at Strasbourg in December 1989, and at the Chequers seminar on Germany in March 1990, the record of which was leaked and cost Nicholas Ridley his cabinet post, a reunified Germany dominant in Central Europe. History has judged her wrong on that question. She was not wrong on the pace. The 2+4 negotiations run by the FCO under Christopher Malaby in Bonn secured the retention of NATO membership for the whole of unified Germany, an outcome Moscow had explicitly refused as late as May 1990. The Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin at 1932 Moscow time on December 25th, 1991. Thatcher had left Downing Street a year earlier. John Major was Prime Minister. Douglas Hurd was still Foreign Secretary. Sir Colin McColl was C. GCHQ's Soviet section was reorganised in the following months. The 46-year assignment for which the British intelligence and military establishment had been designed, argued over, funded and, on April 2nd, 1982, tested in the South Atlantic, had ended. The Sea Harriers were still on the strength of the Fleet Air Arm. They would serve until 2006.